Welcome back to the Monday Morning Point Guard Podcast. On today's episode, going to be discussing the Utah Jazz, and for them, it was yet another disappointing season, yet another setback in the playoffs. So what do they need to do moving forward to get back or get to a level where they're competing for titles? They're likely going to have some really tough decisions ahead. If you did enjoy the video, please be sure to like it as well as subscribe for weekly content. Also, the podcasts are now up on Spotify, so you can listen to the full episode uninterrupted there. And if there's a spot you agree with, disagree with, either reach out to us on Twitter or in that comment section, and we'd love to discuss with you. Jazz fans have to be among the most tortured fan bases in all of professional sports. It's a team that's just always the bridesmaid, but never the bride. And it's especially torturous because the Jazz are among one of the most consistently good teams in the association. In fact, the Jazz are fourth in the NBA all time for win percentage, just behind the Spurs, Lakers, and Celtics. All three of those teams that I just mentioned are multiple time champions and are among the most well-respected teams in the league, and just because of that championship pedigree that they have. And as in the case with those three teams that I just mentioned, there have been some really great players to walk through the doors here for the Jazz, going all the way back to guys like Pistol Pete Maravich and Adrian Dantley. And then you have over a decade of a team led by Karl Malone and John Stockton. And then somewhat more recently, you have great players like Andre Karolinko and Darren Williams. And despite all of those great teams and great players, the Utah Jazz have never won an NBA championship. It's just always been the case of good, but not quite good enough. And for them, that Malone Stockton-led group, they had a well-documented history of playoff disappointment and playoff setbacks until it seemed like they were finally going to get over the top there in the late 90s, and they went to back-to-back finals, but they met a similar fate to many of the great players and great teams in the 90s and ran into those Michael Jordan-led Bulls. And it just never happened for the Malone and Stockton group. The team got old, particularly with those two, and then they ended up splitting up, and the Jazz were forced to start over. And as has been kind of tradition with the Jazz here, they were able to quickly revamp and rebuild around a young star point guard in Darren Williams, the defensive monster small forward that was Andre Karolinko. He was a three-time all-defensive player and actually led the league in shot blocking one season. And then you had double-double machine Carlos Boozer, and that was a really good Jazz team. But as was with the case with the Malone and Stockton group, they just had the misfortune of running into all-time greats throughout that era, and they were eliminated by either the Duncan-led Spurs or the Kobe-led Lakers every time during that Darren Williams-led era. And for the Jazz fans, it feels like it's always the case of whenever they have like a setback in the playoffs or a disappointing run, there's always room for optimism. It always feels like they're able to say it is a disappointing run this year, but next year's our year. We just run it back with this group and next year's our year. And that's just never been the case for them. And if you end up saying that enough years, next year's our year, you just keep saying that over and over, eventually it's too late and the window is closed. And that's what leads me to this current Jazz group, the Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert-led Jazz. It really feels like this group has already missed the window. It felt like the window for them was last year, and to a lesser extent, the bubble season. Last season, it just seems like that was really the year for them. They were top 15 all time in net rating last season during the regular season. So it was a really great regular season team. And then once they got to the playoffs, everything seemed to kind of be breaking their way. You have to have some luck come playoff time. And it seemed like they had the luck kind of in their favor, where maybe in the past they hadn't. They were able to avoid both the Lakers and the Warriors in the first round. And then in the second round, Kawhi Leonard gets hurt in that Clippers series. Everything was kind of set up for them and for their path to the finals. But then Donovan Mitchell gets banged up, and then Terrence Mann has that game where he just goes completely nuts, and then everything just all falls apart. And then even in the bubble, they had a 3-1 lead over the Nuggets, and that was a clearly a year that everything was kind of wide open for the taking. And now all of those disappointments and all of those setbacks have kind of manifested, and now there's a ton of infighting and locker room issues, and that's what's led the team to make a major step back this season as a result. And that infighting is really centered around the team's two best players in Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert, and this has really been brewing ever since the pandemic started. Whenever Rudy Gobert kind of jokingly touched all the microphones at the press conference, kind of prior to COVID being a issue that was being taken seriously, and then like almost immediately he tests positive for COVID, and then later on Donovan Mitchell tests positive. So Mitchell kind of blames Gobert for that. And since then, that chemistry really hasn't gotten any better. It really hasn't improved, but at least the issues now seem to be more basketball related issues. And during one of the podcasts centered around the trade deadline, I talked about the Jazz, and I talked about understanding like the perspectives that both Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell had about one another. On Donovan Mitchell's side of things, Rudy Gobert is paid an obscene amount. He's a max contract player, and a lot of times they treat him like he's a franchise level player, like a franchise carrying level player. However, Rudy really brings nothing to the table offensively outside of a lob threat here and there, and just doesn't really seem to be that tough around the basket, at least on the offensive side of the ball. And Jazz fans, you might know better than me on this, but it seems like Rudy has a really tough time just catching the basketball, at least in the games that I've watched. And for a guard, that's one of the most frustrating things when you throw a beautiful pass to a big guy and he bumbles it, it bounces off of his hands and ends up with the other team. And sure enough, you get a turnover for that. That's really frustrating. And so I understand it. I understand it from Mitchell's perspective. Rudy Gobert would be a really frustrating player to play with offensively. However, on Rudy Gobert's side of things, he also has plenty of reasons to be upset with the situation here. A lot of times, the guys defending on the perimeter appear to just be doing their best impersonation of a statue, and that's been resulting in just wide open and free drives to the rim. And Donovan Mitchell in particular was just an absolute joke defensively in that Mavericks series. And it's especially frustrating for the Donovan Mitchell piece of this because it isn't a case of like Trae Young, where he's just too small, both height and strength wise, to ever be a good defensive player. And while Mitchell isn't tall, he's tall enough. He's also strong enough and athletic enough to be a real impact player on the defensive end if he wanted to be. And even if he doesn't become an impact guy, there's just no excuse for someone that athletic to not at least be a neutral on the defensive end. So everything defensively is on Rudy's shoulders. It's like the equivalent of the Rockets' Harden offense or this current Mavs Luka dependent offense, except on the defensive end. Everything is running through Gobert defensively. So if he doesn't bring it one night or he's in foul trouble, hurt, whatever, the team is easily capable of giving up 130 points just based on what they're all doing perimeter defense wise. And admittedly, I'm not the biggest fan of Rudy, but I think his teammates have really started to take him for granted in this entire organization as a whole. He is just so good on the defensive end and just such a difference maker that I think the Jazz defenders have just gotten too comfortable. They're just so used to Rudy covering up for their mistakes that they feel like they don't really need to try on the defensive end anymore. It's a little like having a really reliable car. The car is so reliable that you never have to do anything major, any major repairs, save for just getting the oil changed. And because the car is so reliable, you start maybe being a little bit late on those oil changes, maybe a little late on getting the filters changed because, hey, the car is reliable, so it's going to be fine. But eventually it leads to a place where you start skipping the oil changes altogether. And then one day you wake up and the car isn't reliable anymore. And now you have to make all those major repairs that you were so excited that you never had to make before. You might be really upset at the car, but really, if you had just kept up with the maintenance, everything would have been fine and you would have never needed those major repairs. I think both the Jazz players and the front office have treated Rudy a little like that car. On the player side, maybe they aren't just putting in as much effort on the defensive end as they had in years past because they're thinking, hey, Rudy's going to make up for any mistake I make on the back end. And then in the front office, they're like, well, why would we need to invest in good perimeter defenders? We have Rudy Gobert. And as a result, this season, the defensive rating for the Jazz was the worst it's been since Quinn Snyder took over as coach. So plenty of frustration to be had on both sides. And now it appears to be kind of at an impasse. This situation appears to be irreparable because it was reported last week that Rudy Gobert planned to give the Jazz an ultimatum saying it's either him or Donovan Mitchell. And I got a good laugh out of that. Like, of course, in a normal scenario, the Jazz are siding with Donovan Mitchell. Like, it just seems like it would have been easier for Rudy to just request a trade. It sounds a little bit like Kyrie going to the Nets front office and saying, like, hey, it's either me or Kevin Durant. Like, of course, the Jazz are going to side with Donovan Mitchell. What are you talking about? But in reality, it's just not quite that simple because there's also been plenty of reports that Donovan Mitchell isn't exactly a happy camper here. So are you willing to risk siding with Mitchell only for him to demand a trade a year or so later, or maybe even less than that, maybe even kind of heading into the trade deadline? I don't know. I mean, I guess the Jazz are the only people who are going to know how unhappy Donovan Mitchell is at this point. Is he just happy because he's playing alongside Gobert? If that's the case, that's a pretty easy fix. But if he's also unhappy with the direction of the team or just playing in Utah in general because it's not a big enough market, then this starts to become a pretty tough decision to make. And that kind of gets me to what I think they should do. I really think they should consider pulling the plug on this whole thing. And I know as a Jazz fan, it's tough to hear. It's tough to hear that your team is going to be entering a rebuild. But I think in the long run, this is going to be the shortest path to accomplishing what they never have, and that's winning a championship. So I'm going to kind of lay out the case and like why I think siding with either of these players is not going to be to their benefit. So let's first go with the scenario where you trade Rudy Gobert and build around Donovan Mitchell. You likely aren't getting a huge haul for Gobert. He's already 29. He's on a massive contract. So getting anything of value is going to be tough. I think a lot of teams are going to view that as we're doing you the favor by taking on his contract as opposed to them thinking that they're acquiring a really special asset. And then there's also kind of this narrative piece with Gobert where, can you play him down the stretch of a game based on what happened last year in that Clippers series where they just pulled him away from the basket and basically tortured him. But I think some of that is a little overblown. I think if you had better perimeter defenders kind of throughout the team who could put up more of a fight on the perimeter, it gives Rudy Gobert a chance to kind of recover, play help defense, and then get back out to his man. But a lot of cases with this Jazz team is guys are just getting like free runs to the hoop, and it doesn't give Rudy enough time to like get down there and help and then get back to his man. He's not exactly quick on his feet. So having said all of that, you're probably not getting anything in a trade that's going to push you any closer to getting to a title than you are now in the short term. And then if you elect to take like the future asset package, like the picks and young players, I've already mentioned Donovan Mitchell might not be the happiest camper here. So is he going to be willing to wait for those young players to develop or for those picks to become something of value? That's pretty doubtful. And even in a scenario, if we create a scenario where the Jazz are basically able to just get out of the Rudy Gobert money just free, like they don't have to take back any contracts. They just ship him off, get some assets back, and they're not any worse off for that cap room they receive back. They're still saddled with some really expensive contracts on some older players that is going to prevent them from getting or making the type of offer to get a free agent who's going to be a real difference maker here. And then also this is Utah, so this isn't exactly a free agent destination to begin with. I'm also not sure that the players who are currently on the roster already are going to be good enough for you to be able to retool on the fly around Mitchell. Who would be the second option to Donovan Mitchell with this current group? Or let's say somehow you get a legitimate second option in a Rudy Gobert trade. Who's going to be the third option here? It just doesn't feel like there's enough here for them to kind of take the next step forward in terms of postseason success. So it's likely taking a major overhaul of the roster if you're going to retool around Mitchell. And that's an overhaul that I'm not sure they have the assets to get it to a place where they're going to be really competitive in the near future. If they decide to side with Rudy Gobert, where is that going to lead? Even though you're likely getting a king's ransom for Donovan Mitchell, again, it's not likely going to lead you to a place where you're any closer to a title than you are today. In fact, quite the opposite. If the Jazz, as an example, elected to try and grab another star player, similar to like the Kawhi Leonard for DeMar DeRozan swap between the Raptors and Spurs a couple of years ago, the player you get back in that deal isn't even going to be as good as Donovan Mitchell, much less be better than Donovan Mitchell. That player you get back might not even be better than Rudy Gobert. So where are you going with Rudy Gobert as your best player, either paired with a worse Donovan Mitchell or just like if you take the young assets and pick space package back, this smattering of young players like RJ Barrett and Emmanuel quickly and maybe a rookie, just as an example. And as I mentioned, I just don't think there's enough left on this roster with the surrounding pieces here. Your Bojan Bogdanovich's, your Jordan Clarkson, Mike Conley. I just don't think there's enough to retool on the fly either around Rudy Gobert or Donovan Mitchell. And then for the young guys, your Jared Butler, your Udoka Azubuike, your Nickeil Alexander Walker, they haven't showed enough in this league to be the type of player that you can package with like an expiring vet or just an expiring contract to grab a real upgrade. I just don't think they're enticing enough as pieces. The Jazz, they pushed all the chips in a few years ago and they weren't able to make it happen championship wise. So now the window is closed. Rudy Gobert is getting older. Jordan Clarkson is getting older. And then guys like Conley and Boyan, they're entering the old man stage of their career. So let's just rip the Band-Aid off now rather than wait a few years and toil around with some first round exits or some play-ins. And the trade package for Donovan Mitchell would be absolutely absurd. Like James Harden going to the Nets or Paul George heading to the Clippers. That type of package, I think, is what you could really expect from him. Like you're going to get some really young, promising players like RJ Barrett as an example, and just a whole mess of draft picks. And when you combine that with a potential Rudy Gobert deal, even if it's just a couple of picks, your rebuild is going to be set up as well as any team in the league, with exception to maybe the Thunder. And I will say Donovan Mitchell is only 25. So if you want to kick that can down the road a little bit further, I'm fine with that. I don't know how far I want to kick that can down the road as the Jazz, though. I saw some things in the playoffs that I would be really concerned with going forward if I'm making Donovan Mitchell the face of my franchise. I mentioned the huge step back he took on defense this year, but there's also some shot selection stuff that I really didn't like during that Mavericks series, just settling for some really difficult shots down the stretch of games. He's been around in this league long enough and been in enough playoff games that neither of those should be issues at this stage. This is the time in his career where he should really be putting it all together, really taking the next step into becoming the type of guy who can lead a team through the playoffs. And if you think about some of his contemporaries, guys like Devin Booker, Zach LaVine, Jason Tatum, all of those guys have taken huge strides in the right direction over the last two seasons. Booker was good stats, bad team guy for a long time, but he has proven on the biggest stage that he can lead a team. And especially this season, you can really see how much he's bought in on the defensive end. Jason Tatum was in the same draft class as Donovan Mitchell, and he's taken a massive leap forward this season. He was always a good defender, but now he's starting to enter that elite category. Shot selection wise, or just settling for tough shots, that was always a huge issue for Tatum early on, but it seems like he's really put that in the past and is turning into one of the league's just very best players. LaVine was a guy I used to think of the way that I now think of Donovan Mitchell, a guy who just settles for way too many tough shots and plays no defense. But after the Olympics, we really saw a new LaVine, a guy who was really putting an effort on the defensive end. And now he's really learned to thrive and coexist alongside another star player and a wing at that in DeMar DeRozan. All three of those guys are making major steps into becoming top players in today's league going forward. And it feels like Donovan Mitchell is going backwards. This is really, as I mentioned, the stage in Mitchell's career where he needs to be putting it all together, really learning from his mistakes of the past and buying into doing the little things that it takes to win at the highest level. And he just doesn't appear to be going in that direction. I'm not willing to give up on him yet. That would be just silly. So maybe he has some type of come to Jesus, long look in the mirror type moment this offseason, or if he does get dealt, maybe the fresh start and change of scenery is just what the doctor ordered. But either way, I don't like the direction that things are kind of going for him. And that's why if I'm the Jazz, I would be willing to move off of him. I think the value for him is as high as it's ever going to be. And in the case that he demands a trade, your negotiation power will be diminished in a real way rather than if you get out ahead of this thing and try to get as much value as you can. Either way, buckle up if you're a Jazz fan. There are likely some major changes heading your way this offseason. The good news, though, is that this is an organization who, over the years, have shown themselves to be extremely competent. So, whatever they decide to do, I think the fans can trust the direction of this franchise. I still think it's time to tear this thing down and start over. The Jazz, they pushed all the chips in and did everything that they possibly could to try to turn this into a title contender, but it just wasn't meant to be. So, hit the reset button and start the rebuild earlier rather than later. And then, hopefully, for Jazz fans' sake, this is the last rebuild that is required to get them to a title.